We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The storm had moved in from the Canadian border with a kind of slow, deliberate menace on the morning of January 12, 1991, swallowing the Green Mountains in white haze by noon and forcing road crews in Addison County to abandon their usual routes in favor of emergency-only plowing. 15-year-old Rebecca Lowell, a sophomore at Middlebury Union High School and an experienced snowmobiler since age 9, told her parents she would be taking the family ski-doo out for a short ride before the worst of the storm hit. The Lowells lived on 46 acres of wooded property just outside the small town of East Middlebury, population 1,204 in the 1990 census, where winter meant early nights, frozen ponds, and engines echoing through tree lines on weekends. Rebecca left the house at 3:14 p.m., her father's watchful nod following her through the mudroom window, the yellow ski-doo jacket bright against the encroaching gray. By 3:22 p.m., both of her parents would later testify, the roar of the snowmobile's engine had faded into the forest, swallowed by wind and a curtain of rapidly thickening snowfall. That would be the last sound anyone ever heard from Rebecca Lowell. The first hour passed without concern. Rebecca often made loops behind the old sugar shack, raced across the frozen hayfields, or followed the narrow, well-marked trail that curved toward the abandoned Eisenhart property near the edge of the national forest. But by 4:45 p.m., with visibility dropping to less than 30 feet and the storm intensifying far earlier than the forecast predicted, her mother, Dawn, began to pace between windows, wiping away condensation to peer into a wall of white that revealed nothing but swirling flakes and the vague shadow of the horse barn. Her father, Daniel, retrieved his coat, muttering that Rebecca probably stalled the sled in deep powder and would be walking it back any minute. It was 5:12 p.m. when he stepped outside with a flashlight, sweeping its trembling beam across the frozen yard, calling her name into wind gusts that carried his voice upward rather than outward. Snow drifts rose inch by inch as he trudged to the barn, then to the tree line, then back to the house, his jeans stiff with ice, his breath a gray cloud. By 5:40 p.m., he radioed the county sheriff's office. A deputy arrived at 6:17 p.m., headlights pushing back a storm that had transformed the Lowell's property into an indistinguishable landscape of rolling white dunes. Dawn stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself as if holding her ribs together, the porch light flickering in wind strong enough to rattle the aluminum siding. The deputy, a 29-year-old named Ethan Carver, listened carefully as Daniel described Rebecca's planned route. Carver nodded, scanning the tree line with a practiced eye while icy pellets struck his face horizontally. He had grown up in Vermont, trained in rural search and rescue techniques, and believed firmly that most lost snowmobilers, even teenagers, were found within a mile or two, disoriented, cold, embarrassed, but alive. At 6:32 p.m., Carver and Daniel located the first sign of Rebecca, the ski-doo's tracks running parallel to the sugarbush path, leading deeper into the woods. The tracks were fresh, deeply cut, sharply defined, proof that she'd been riding only an hour or so before the storm peak. Carver followed them methodically, shining his powerful lantern across the trail as the wind began to shift, creating pockets of stillness that lasted seconds before exploding back into chaos. The tracks continued for nearly half a mile, curving around pine clusters, crossing a narrow frozen stream, and rejoining the wider trail that led toward the Eisenhart land, where an old farmhouse had collapsed years earlier under heavy snowfall. At 6:59 p.m., the tracks reached a clearing. At 7:01 p.m., they ended. Not faded. Not buried. Not distorted or blown away by the storm. They ended, abruptly, unnaturally, in a clean line, as if the snowmobile had simply risen into the air and disappeared. Carver crouched over the final impressions, studying them with growing disbelief. The treads were crisp and deeply grooved, indicating the ski-doo had been moving at normal speed. The track pattern continued uninterrupted for 27 feet, then stopped mid-curve, the last imprint half-formed, a partial arc carved into the snow. Beyond that point, untouched powder, smooth as porcelain, unmarked by machine, boot, animal, or struggle. Carver's breath fogged the air as he whispered, "This doesn't make sense." Daniel stared at the silent expanse, gripping the deputy's shoulder so hard his knuckles whitened beneath the glove. "Where is she? Where did she go?" Carver radioed for backup, his voice steady by sheer force of training. Dawn's scream carried faintly through the trees from the direction of the house when he delivered the update. By 8:12 p.m., 4 snowmobiles from the volunteer search and rescue team arrived, headlights cutting through the desolate clearing. The team fanned out, probing the tree line, checking for signs of a crash, an overturned sled, broken branches, anything. but the forest held its silence. At 9:03 p.m., the storm reached whiteout conditions, forcing the team to retreat to the Lowell house for safety. Dawn paced in circles, crying silently, while Daniel stood in the doorway, refusing to remove his boots, convinced he might need to sprint outside at any moment. Overnight temperatures dropped to -9 degrees. At sunrise, the storm passed, leaving behind a stillness so complete the world felt temporarily suspended. Fresh teams arrived, including a state police search unit with trained canine handlers. But the dogs were useless. They lost Rebecca's scent exactly where the snowmobile tracks ended, circling wildly before whining in confusion. Helicopters scanned the area despite treacherous winds. Ground searchers formed grids extending 5 miles in all directions. Volunteers combed every ravine, creek bed, and thicket. Nothing. No snowmobile. No broken branches. No blood. No signs of dragging or struggle. No footprints, Rebecca's or anyone else's. Just a clean, impossible ending in a clearing where nothing made sense. Word of her disappearance spread through East Middlebury by mid-morning. By noon, students at the high school were whispering theories that ranged from runaway fantasies to abduction stories to supernatural speculation. By afternoon, reporters from Burlington and Montpelier arrived, slipping through the storm-laden backroads with satellite vans and microphones. One reporter called it the Vermont vanishing point, a phrase that would haunt the Lowell family for years. Detectives interviewed Rebecca's classmates, teachers, her younger brother, and her best friend, Allison Pike, who claimed Rebecca had seemed distracted for days, asking strange questions about old trails and forgotten logging roads near the edge of the national forest. Rebecca's English teacher revealed that she had turned in a short essay that week about places where the world thins, an assignment that would be dissected endlessly by internet forums decades later. But none of these details explained how a 15-year-old could vanish without a single physical trace from a clearing where the snow itself should have recorded everything. Investigators returned repeatedly to the site where the tracks ended. They photographed the impressions from every angle measured. Studied weather data, consulted snowmobile mechanics, physicists, and survival experts. The consensus was always the same: the disappearance was physically impossible. Snowmobiles don't vanish. People don't walk away without leaving tracks. Nature doesn't erase evidence so precisely and selectively. Yet the clearing remained silent, pristine, and unsolved. By the end of January, the search shifted from rescue to recovery. By mid-February, the official investigation stalled. By March, the case was declared cold. And by summer 1991, the Lowell family stood alone, surrounded by maps, photographs, and a growing suspicion that the truth lay hidden somewhere deeper than the snowmobile tracks, somewhere the community of East Middlebury didn't want to look. The mystery that began with a simple ride into a winter storm would take 30 years to unravel, eventually exposing long-buried secrets, false assumptions, and a truth far more unsettling than anyone in Vermont could have imagined. In the weeks after the search officially scaled back, East Middlebury learned to talk around the Lowell name the way people in small towns learn to talk around a closed factory or a burned-down house. The loss acknowledged in pauses and glances rather than words, but never fully addressed head-on. The shelves of the general store still held Rebecca's favorite raspberry licorice, untouched and gathering dust. And her locker at Middlebury Union High School remained unassigned for the rest of the year, a metal coffin of spiral notebooks and folded notes that her mother refused to empty when the administration called. Dawn started sleeping in Rebecca's room, curled on top of the quilt she had sewn the previous summer, listening for an engine that would never return and watching headlights sweep the ceiling as plow trucks moved through the night, each pass sounding like a promise broken in slow motion. Daniel responded differently. He threw himself into work at the sawmill, taking overtime shifts until his hands blistered beneath his gloves, his shoulders knotting with a kind of permanent tension that chiropractors wrote articles about. At night, instead of sleeping, he sat at the kitchen table with topographic maps unfolded in front of him, tracing every trail, gully, and forgotten logging road within 10 miles of their property, marking them with red pen until the paper looked like it had been wounded. Every free weekend until the thaw he rode his own snowmobile or hiked through slush and mud, revisiting the clearing where Rebecca's tracks ended, walking wider and wider circles around that impossible point, testing every theory that came to him at 3 a.m. Hidden sinkholes, thin ice, abandoned wells, secret roads. Deputies humored him at first, joining his searches when schedules allowed, but by March their tone shifted from collaborative concern to the weary patience reserved for family members who cannot accept what the evidence refuses to yield. Ethan Carver visited the Lowell house less frequently as the months passed, each knock on the door delivering less news than the last, reduced to phrases like no new leads and we're still reviewing tips, until even those scripts felt dishonest. The file in the Addison County Sheriff's Office thickened with witness statements, snowpack analyses, meteorological charts, and expert letters, but no new page changed the central fact. There was no physical way for Rebecca to have left that clearing without leaving a trace, and yet she was gone. Rumors filled the vacuum that evidence left behind. Some neighbors whispered that Rebecca must have run away, that the tracks ending in the clearing were part of an elaborate staging she crafted after watching too many television shows about disappearances. Others, less willing to accuse a grieving family, suggested an out-of-state abductor on a secondary machine who had driven parallel to her in the storm, lifting her onto his sled at exactly the right moment while snow and wind covered his approach, a theory popular mainly among people who had never ridden a snowmobile in whiteout conditions. The more superstitious residents leaned into older stories, muttering about places in the Green Mountains where compasses spun and hunters got turned around for hours in familiar woods, about an old Abenaki legend that spoke of thin places where the world wore through like thread and things slipped between. None of that brought Rebecca back, and none of it helped Dawn when she started waking from dreams where she heard her daughter's voice calling from the tree line, close enough to recognize but too far to reach. By the time spring arrived and dirty snowbanks retreated from the roadsides, the media had moved on, leaving behind a single haunting moniker, the Vermont vanishing point. True crime magazines ran speculative pieces with grainy black and white photos of the clearing, red circles drawn around the final tracks like bullet holes, while a regional news program aired a segment that lingered a second too long on a close-up of Dawn's face, catching the exact moment her composure cracked on camera. Donations to a community reward fund peaked in March, then dribbled to a stop by July, the jar on the counter at the diner gradually filling instead with spare change for the Little League uniforms. The official investigation transitioned to what the paperwork called limited active status, meaning that tips would be logged and occasionally pursued, but no new dedicated resources would be assigned unless something concrete surfaced. Nothing did. The first anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance arrived with muted ceremonies, a candlelight vigil on the high school football field, a framed photo by the concession stand, a pastor who struggled to strike a balance between hope and acceptance. Dawn stood near the 50-yard line, holding a candle that dripped hot wax on her fingers without her noticing, while Daniel hovered at the edge of the crowd, unable to bring himself any closer to the murmured prayers and out-of-tune hymns. When the pastor spoke Rebecca's name aloud, several students started to cry, but most of the adults stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on some distant point that might have been the scoreboard or might have been the clearing where snowmobile tracks stopped beneath a winter sky. As years layered over the initial shock, the case settled into the town's subconscious, resurfacing only when new storms rolled in or when another child asked why there was a plaque with Rebecca's name on the wall outside the school auditorium. Dawn returned to work part-time at the dental office in town, moving slowly, misplacing instruments, sometimes staring at a young patient's ponytail with a look so haunted that one hygienist quietly began swapping rooms with her. Daniel left the sawmill after a minor accident in which he nearly lost 2 fingers to a misfed board, switching to seasonal work with a landscaping company where the worst he could do was overcut a hedge. They stayed in the house despite suggestions from well-meaning relatives that a fresh start might help. Both of them understood something those relatives did not. Leaving the property meant leaving the last place Rebecca had been alive, the last sound of an engine, the last visible proof of her existence in the physical world captured by snow. In 1997, 6 years after the disappearance, a retired state trooper named David Kirsch briefly revived public interest when he published an article in a law enforcement journal analyzing the Lowell case as an example of what he termed perceived impossibility, arguing that investigators often misinterpret environmental evidence because they expect the world to behave consistently even when conditions, like blizzards, create anomalies. He suggested that wind patterns could create the illusion of intact snow where partial tracks once existed and speculated that the snowmobile may have veered off the visible path just before the storm filled in the gap. The article never offered a definitive explanation, but it provided enough pseudo-scientific reassurance that local authorities clung to it like a life raft, citing it when journalists occasionally called for anniversary pieces. Dawn read the article once, folded it neatly, and buried it at the bottom of a drawer, feeling a flicker of rage at the idea that anyone could flatten her daughter's existence into a case study of perception. Still, the theory seeped into the community, giving people language to use when they needed to convince themselves that the universe hadn't broken that day in the clearing. The case drifted officially into cold status in 2001, 10 years after Rebecca vanished. The file, labeled Lowell Rebecca A., January 12, 91, was moved from the active case shelf behind the detectives' desks to a deeper, dustier cabinet in the basement, joining a small but stubborn collection of unsolved homicides, missing persons, and inexplicable fires. A rookie deputy assigned to reorganize the cabinets that spring flipped through Rebecca's file, pausing over the photographs of the tracks, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the concrete floor. He had been 4 years old when she disappeared. To him, the images looked less like documentation of a crime scene and more like something from a strange dream he might have had as a child. He brought the file upstairs to his supervisor, suggesting a fresh look, but was waved off with a tired smile and a reminder that the department barely had the manpower to handle current calls, let alone resurrect ghosts. Time marched in the way it does in small towns, measured not in headlines but in graduations, funerals, new stoplights, and the occasional chain restaurant arriving with the promise of jobs and the threat of traffic. Rebecca's classmates grew up, scattered for college, jobs, or the military, then drifted back in dribs and drabs, bringing spouses and children who played on the same snowy hills where she and Allison once raced sleds. Some avoided the Lowells entirely out of guilt or discomfort, others made awkward, stilted small talk in grocery aisles, both parties pretending not to remember sleepovers and algebra tests and the particular way Rebecca had laughed when she was trying not to. Allison herself left Vermont for good in 1999, moving to Seattle and, by all accounts, never returning even for holidays, though she mailed a Christmas card to Dawn every year without fail, each one signed with the same loopinga that had once filled the margins of Rebecca's notebooks. In 2016, 25 years after the disappearance, the Vermont State Police launched a new cold case unit, a small team funded by a mix of state budget reallocations and federal grants, tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides and suspicious missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s. The Lowell case landed on the docket partly because of its notoriety and partly because a young detective named Mark Hennessy had grown up in Addison County hearing whispers about the girl whose tracks stopped. Hennessy requested the file not out of idle curiosity but from a growing conviction that something about the case had been missed, if not in the physical search, then in the assumptions that guided it. He was 32, methodical, and less inclined than some of his colleagues to dismiss anomalies with phrases like "it's just one of those things." When he opened the file in the sterile fluorescent light of the cold case unit's windowless office, he found the same photographs, diagrams, and statements that had haunted his predecessors, the tracks ending mid-curve, the weather reports, the canine handler's notes about scent loss, the map grids Daniel had drawn by hand. But he also found something else, buried near the back of the file in a small evidence envelope attached to an aging chain of custody form, a set of fibers and partial impressions collected from the clearing that had been tested in 1991 with limited technology and then essentially ignored when no obvious match surfaced. The lab report described them as textile fragments consistent with synthetic outerwear, color undetermined due to contamination by snowmelt and soil. At the time, the logic had been simple. Of course the clearing contained textile fibers. Rebecca had been wearing a snowmobile suit, gloves, and a helmet. Nothing about that seemed significant. Yet Hennessy, trained in an era when forensic science had leapt forward in ways his 1990s predecessors could not have imagined, stared at the envelope with a growing sense that the key to the Lowell case might not lie in where the track stopped, but in what microscopic traces remained where the snowmobile had supposedly been alone. Hennessy signed out the evidence envelope on a Wednesday morning in October 2016, the kind of brittle, leaf-skittering morning when the mountains smelled faintly of wood smoke and the cold crept into the pores of the day before anyone acknowledged winter's approach, and he carried it to the state lab in Waterbury with a seriousness that belied the object's feather-light weight. He felt, irrationally but unmistakably, that he was transporting something volatile, a clue that had been sleeping for 25 years and might crumble if mishandled. The lab's textile and trace analyst, Dr. Jenna Rourke, was younger than he expected, late 20s, brisk, unflappable, the kind of scientist whose ponytail and steady monotone gave the impression that she had passed beyond surprise years ago, but she raised an eyebrow when she read the age of the sample. Cold cases weren't unusual for her, but ones involving degraded snowmelt contamination from 1991 were practically archaeological. She examined the contents beneath a comparison microscope, adjusting focus rings with the same calm precision surgeons used when cutting tissue. Hennessy stood behind her, hands clasped behind his back, resisting the urge to pace. After 20 minutes of silence punctuated only by the soft clink of glass slides, Rourke leaned back and said something that immediately tightened the knot in his chest. Whatever these fibers are, they're not consistent with the materials used in Ski-Doo outerwear in 1991. She explained that Rebecca's suit would have been made of a specific nylon poly blend common to the early 90s, engineered for cold resistance and durability. But the fibers from the clearing contained a different synthetic signature, an acrylic wool composite rarely used in youth outerwear and more commonly found in adult cold weather gear from the late 80s. When Hennessy asked if contamination from snow, soil, or even the search team could explain it, Rourke shook her head. The weave pattern is too distinct. This came from a garment with a tighter, older textile structure. Someone else was in that clearing. The words hung between them like frost. Someone else. 425 years, every official report insisted that Rebecca had been alone when her tracks ended. Hennessy requested additional analyses, and Rourke agreed to run infrared spectroscopy and attempt mitochondrial DNA extraction, though she warned that the odds of recoverable biological material after 2 decades were slim. Still, she handled the fibers with the reverence of a curator uncovering relics, while Hennessy stepped into the hallway, pulse hammering with a kind of cold clarity he hadn't felt since joining the unit. The Lowell case might not have been an active environmental anomaly or a runaway fantasy. It might have been a crime scene compromised by a blizzard and misinterpreted by desperate investigators. That night, unable to sleep, he reread every witness interview, every statement, every geographic survey of the Lowell property and surrounding land. Patterns emerged, subtle, easily dismissed, but patterns nonetheless. A neighbor, Richard Rick Keating, had mentioned during his 1991 interview that he'd seen an unfamiliar snowmobile trailer driving past his property around 3:45 p.m. on the day Rebecca vanished, but investigators dismissed it, reasoning that trailers were common during snowmobile season. Another resident, an older woman named Florence Mills, had claimed she heard 2 engines near the Eisenhart clearing shortly before the storm worsened, but she suffered from tinnitus, and her statement was quietly sidelined. Then there was the detail that hit Hennessy like a punch. The search and rescue roster from the first night listed a volunteer who had never participated in any subsequent searches and whose address, when Hennessy cross-referenced it, led to an empty plot of land. The name was D.C. Harper, handwritten in hurried script, with no badge number or signature. In 1991, overwhelmed deputies might have accepted any warm body offering help during a blizzard, but in retrospect the entry felt like a loose thread begging to be pulled. Over the next 2 months, Hennessy dug into public records, property records, and DMV archives, chasing every variant of the name Harper, but nothing aligned with the mysterious volunteer. Either the name was an alias, or someone had joined the search that night under false pretenses, someone who might have had a vested interest in shaping or observing the investigation. Meanwhile, the lab results from Rourke trickled in. Infrared spectroscopy confirmed her initial assessment. The fibers came from a garment manufactured between 1983 and 1987, likely a men's winter coat with a distinctive acrylic wool blend. Mitochondrial DNA extraction failed, unsurprising after so much environmental exposure, but the chemical profile alone was enough to classify the fibers as foreign to Rebecca's clothing and inconsistent with the search team's gear. For the first time in 25 years, a documented anomaly in the clearing could not be attributed to weather or error. During a December meeting, the cold case unit supervisor, Lieutenant Ramos, expressed cautious interest but warned Hennessy not to build castles out of snowfall. The unit had limited resources, and unless he could produce something actionable, reopening the Lowell case formally would draw political scrutiny the department wanted to avoid. But Hennessy couldn't let it go. He felt pulled, as though the case were a current beneath thin ice, tugging at his ankles. He revisited the Lowell property, walking the land with Daniel, whose grief had settled into that quiet, heavy stillness that made him seem carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding them. Daniel showed him the exact route Rebecca typically took, the sugar shack, the frozen creek she crossed, the clearing where her tracks ended. The trees had grown thicker in 25 years, their shadows longer, the land subtly rearranged by storms and seasons, but the clearing still carried a strange weight, a hush that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. They stood together in the center, where the last track impression had been photographed, right foot of the left ski, half arc frozen in time, and for a moment the air seemed unnaturally still, as if holding a breath. Hennessy asked Daniel whether anyone had been feuding with the family in 1991, whether Rebecca had mentioned any adults she felt uneasy around, whether anyone in the snowmobile community had acted strange after her disappearance. Daniel shook his head to each question, but when pressed about unfamiliar snowmobiles, he hesitated. He remembered, now that he was forced to dig, that in early January 1991, a week or 2 before Rebecca vanished, he had heard a snowmobile engine on the far edge of the property late at night, close to 11, long after typical riding hours. He'd gone outside with a flashlight, saw nothing but darkness and blowing snow, and chalked it up to someone from the next property over. He never reported it. At the time, it felt insignificant. But to Hennessy it was another thread. Back in the office, he compiled a list of every resident in Addison County in 1991 who owned snowmobiles manufactured before 1988, filtering for those who had lived within 6 miles of the Lowell property. 42 names. He filtered again for anyone with a criminal record involving minors, violence, or stalking. 9 names. Then he cross-referenced employment records for anyone who worked night shifts during the winter of 1990 to 91, since whoever encountered Rebecca would have needed the freedom to move unnoticed in a storm. 3 names. Only one appeared on all 3 lists, a man named Dennis Harper, no middle initial C, who had lived on a small plot of land off Route 125 in 1991, owned an older Polaris Indy built in 1985, worked night maintenance at Middlebury College, and moved out of state in 1992. A chill raced up Hennessy's spine. Harper. D. Harper. The mysterious volunteer. The empty address. He dug deeper and discovered that Harper had left Vermont suddenly after selling his property at below market value, leaving no forwarding address. Property records showed he divorced in 1992. The dissolution documents included a brief statement from his ex-wife claiming he had a volatile temper and unpredictable behaviors during winter months. There was no record of criminal charges, no complaints from neighbors, nothing overtly suspicious beyond a pattern of instability. But then came the detail that turned suspicion into certainty. Buried in the 1991 search logs was an equipment inventory noting that a volunteer, unnamed, had arrived at the Lowell property wearing a dark brown wool-blend parka with torn sleeves. The descriptions matched the textile profile of the fibers from the clearing. In January 2017, Hennessy tracked Harper to a small town in upstate New York, where he worked sporadically in construction under the table, living in a rented trailer near the edge of the Adirondacks. The man who answered the door was in his late 50s, gray-haired, gaunt, and visibly startled to see a Vermont detective. At first he claimed ignorance. He didn't remember any Lowell, any disappearance, any search during a Vermont blizzard. But when Hennessy mentioned the clearing, the snowmobile tracks, the broken circle where Rebecca's path ended, Harper's demeanor shifted. His hands twitched. His jaw trembled. And he said, almost inaudibly, "I knew someone would come eventually." What followed was not a confession, not yet, but a story fractured by fear and time, an explanation that twisted around itself like roots beneath frozen soil. Harper admitted he had been in the woods that day. He admitted he had seen Rebecca ride past him on the trail, her yellow jacket bright in the storm. He admitted he had approached the clearing minutes after she disappeared. But he insisted with a growing desperation that bordered on terror, that he had not touched her, not harmed her, not even spoken to her. Instead he claimed that when he reached the clearing, he found the same impossible scene investigators did, tracks ending in untouched snow. "I didn't do anything to her," he whispered, eyes darting toward the treeline beyond the trailer window. "I didn't take her. I couldn't have taken her. Something else was there that day. Something I followed. Something I shouldn't have followed." Hennessy left the trailer with a sick twist in his gut, not because he believed Harper's supernatural inference, but because Harper, guilty or not, was hiding something far more grounded, more human, more deliberate. And whatever truth had lived in that clearing in 1991 was not done revealing itself. Harper's trailer door had barely clicked shut behind Hennessy before the detective felt the weight of the man's final words claw at the edge of his rational mind, not because he believed in anything supernatural, but because Harper's fear wasn't performative. It carried the sharp, metallic scent of memory, the kind forged only in moments when a person witnesses something they can't process without fracturing. Driving back toward Middlebury in the violet bruise of an Adirondack dusk, Hennessy replayed every micro-expression, every tremor in Harper's voice, every hesitant glance toward the woods, and the more he dissected it, the more he understood that the man's terror wasn't rooted in guilt. It was rooted in something else, something older, something he'd never spoken aloud for fear that naming it would make it real. Over the next week, Hennessy dove into Harper's history with surgical precision. He contacted the ex-wife Lorraine, who now lived in Maine and ran a small antique shop. Her initial tone was wary, but when he mentioned Rebecca's disappearance, something in her voice thinned. She said Dennis had always been uneasy in deep woods, particularly during winter storms. He'd returned from night shifts trembling, muttering about shapes moving between trees, or echoes that didn't come from animals. At the time, she'd assumed stress, late hours, maybe early-onset mental illness, but she also admitted reluctantly that during the winter of 1991 he'd had 3 unexplained panic attacks, waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, insisting that the girl wasn't alone out there. When Hennessy pressed for clarity, Lorraine shut down, whispering, "He sees things differently than most people. And he's terrified of being blamed for something he didn't do, which makes him look guilty even when he isn't." Meanwhile, Dr. Rourke called with an update that made the hairs on Hennessy's arms lift. she'd located a microabrasion on one of the fibers, a curved striation typical of friction against metal teeth. The wool-acrylic blend had likely brushed against an older zipper. The early 80s coats from regional manufacturers often used brass alloy zippers, distinct in morphology. Only 2 brands in Vermont had produced winter jackets with that composite, a small defunct manufacturer in Rutland, and a regional store brand from Burlington. And both, in a stroke of grim symmetry, were commonly purchased by hunters, woodsworkers, and maintenance staff men who spent long hours alone in the woods. The discovery tightened the circle even further around Harper. But something still didn't align. If Harper had harmed Rebecca, why stage the scene in a way that invited scrutiny rather than avoided it? Why show up to the search? Why volunteer his name, albeit incomplete, when he could have vanished without consequence during a blizzard? And most importantly, why carry a fear so primal it bordered on religious dread? Hennessy brought his findings to Lieutenant Ramos, who raised an eyebrow at the mounting implications but gave him conditional clearance to continue his off-book inquiries, as long as he avoided triggering media attention. Cold cases were politically delicate. The department couldn't risk reopening old wounds without concrete progress. This meant Hennessy had to proceed like a ghost, threading the line between investigation and obsession. He revisited Florence Mills, the elderly woman who'd claimed she'd heard 2 engines the day Rebecca vanished. Now 93 and confined to an assisted living center, her memory was fragmented but surprisingly intact regarding certain sensory details. When Hennessy asked about the engines, she described the rhythm with startling clarity. One was normal, she said, tapping a slow, steady beat against her armrest. The other was wrong. Too fast. Too thin. Like a sewing needle scraping ice. The metaphor was peculiar, but it echoed Harper's trembling description of something I shouldn't have followed. Back in the archives, Hennessy reviewed all reports of unusual sounds or sightings from the storm of February 1991. 2 hunters in the next county reported hearing an odd mechanical whine around 4:20 p.m. Another resident mentioned seeing a pale flash in the woods but attributed it to lightning, despite no atmospheric activity recorded at that time. These fragmented, seemingly unrelated accounts formed the faint outline of a pattern, but not one grounded in crime, rather one grounded in the unpredictable, disorienting effects of blizzard acoustics and optical distortions. Yet combined with Harper's reaction, it demanded attention. Searching deeper into Harper's background, Hennessy discovered that in December 1990, just 2 months before Rebecca disappeared, Harper had been part of a crew clearing a remote service road near Bread Loaf when he reported seeing a person standing in the center of the trail at dusk. By the time his snowmobile reached the figure, it had vanished without tracks. The incident was documented in a campus maintenance log as possible illusion due to low visibility, but Harper had taken 2 emergency leave days afterward. Another thread. Another tremor. Another reason Harper might have interpreted an ordinary crime as something far more sinister. But despite these eerie elements, Hennessy remained grounded. He didn't believe in inexplicable phenomena. He believed Harper had done something to the girl, intentionally or accidentally, and was burying the memory beneath layers of delusion. Determined to break through Harper's fog, Hennessy returned to New York in late January, this time requesting a formal interview at the local sheriff's substation. Harper arrived pale, shaking, his parka half-zipped even indoors. He sat across from Hennessy with the same hunted expression he'd worn during their first meeting. Hennessy began gently, asking him to walk through the timeline again, minute by minute. Harper's eyes darted like trapped birds, but he complied. He admitted following the trail because he thought Rebecca was lost. He admitted entering the clearing and seeing the abrupt end of her tracks. But this time, under the slow tightening pressure of Hennessy's questions, he added something new. He had seen impressions in the snow beyond the clearing, disturbances subtle. Shallow, almost erased by wind, but not natural. They weren't footprints, he insisted, voice cracking. They were drags. Slides. Like something was pulled. Hennessy's pulse jumped. He leaned forward. Pulled by who? Harper stared at the table. I don't know. I didn't see anyone. Just movement in the trees. Then why didn't you tell the investigators in 1991? Harper's breath hitched. Because I didn't think they'd believe me. Because I barely believed me. Because by the time the storm cleared, the marks were gone. And I thought if I said anything, they'd think I did it. This admission rang with a hollow resonance of suppressed guilt, but not necessarily guilt of violence. It could just as easily be guilt of cowardice, of fleeing instead of helping. At the end of the interview, Hennessy slid a photograph across the table, a pristine scan of the fiber Rourke analyzed. "This came from your coat," he said softly. Harper looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he broke. Not with confession, but with sobbing panic. "I tried to move her," he whispered. "I tried to pull her back toward the trail. But she wasn't there anymore. I reached down and my hand touched nothing." The room went still. Hennessy's heart slammed once, hard, against his ribs. Because for the first time, Harper wasn't lying, not evasive, not hallucinating, not constructing a defensive narrative. There was a specific physical truth buried in his words. He had touched something. Or someone. The fiber-proved contact occurred. But if he tried to move her, and failed, what had he touched in that clearing? What exactly had been lying in the snow before the storm erased it? And where had it gone in the minutes before the search began? Rebecca had not vanished into thin air, of that Hennessy was certain. But the void left behind in the clearing was not metaphorical. It was literal. A space once filled, then emptied. Quickly, quietly, efficiently, as if removed by hands that knew the land. Or by someone watching the entire scene unfold, waiting for the exact right moment when the storm would swallow the evidence. Someone still out there. Someone who had eluded investigators for 25 years. And now finally, a shape began forming in Hennessy's mind. Not supernatural, not impossible, just human, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise. The case was no longer cold. It was awake. Hennessy drove back toward Middlebury with the heater blasting and the radio off, every mile of frozen Vermont asphalt pulling him deeper into a realization he didn't want to articulate yet, not even to himself. Harper's breakdown hadn't been the trembling collapse of a guilty man finally cornered. It had been the collapse of someone who had held on too long to a truth too strange to share, someone who had spent 25 years wrestling with the memory of touching something in the snow that he believed was Rebecca, and finding nothing where her body should have been. It wasn't a supernatural claim. It wasn't even irrational when broken down. It was the desperate sensory recollection of a man trapped in blinding whiteout conditions, trying to drag an unconscious girl toward safety. It only seemed impossible because the evidence in 1991 hadn't supported it. No secondary tracks, no drag marks, no blood, no signs of a struggle. But now, with the fiber analysis confirming physical contact between Rebecca's coat and Harper's zipper, Hennessy understood the critical question wasn't whether Harper had reached her. It was what happened in the minutes after he did. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat at his kitchen table with crime scene photos, maps, weather reports, and Dr. Rourke's analysis spread beneath the dull glow of an overhead lamp. He traced the snowmobile route Rebecca took, then Harper's route, then the topography around the clearing. 2 ridgelines flanked the zone on opposite sides, creating a funnel effect that intensified wind shear during blizzards. Snow drift maps from the National Weather Service archives showed that the clearing had experienced microdrift swells that night, peaks and troughs where snow could pile 2 feet high in 10 minutes. That explained the disappearance of drag marks. It explained partial impressions. But it did not explain where Rebecca went. Nor did it explain the reports from that night, scattered through witness statements like breadcrumbs, of that thin, unnatural mechanical whine. The sound Florence Mills described. The sound 2 hunters heard. The sound Harper alluded to without realizing it. At 3:12 a.m., unable to sit any longer, Hennessy drove to the university security office and asked the night supervisor, a bored grad student scrolling through his phone, to let him into the storage room holding digitized archives from the early 1990s. There, on an ancient external drive labeled Incident Audio 1988 to 1993, he found what he didn't expect, a series of recorded emergency weather bulletins from the day of Rebecca's disappearance, including background audio during transmission testing. One clip made him sit up straight. Behind the crackle of analog static, layered faintly beneath wind distortion, there was a high, steady tone, thin, metallic, oscillating at a frequency too uniform to be natural. He played it a dozen times, eyes narrowing with each repetition. It wasn't a snowmobile. It wasn't a generator. It wasn't any equipment he recognized from his years investigating rural machinery thefts. It was, if he dared name it, surgical, controlled, purposeful. And it was recorded at 4:11 p.m., approximately 9 minutes after Rebecca's last known location. By the time dawn approached, Hennessy had built a new theory, one that diverged sharply from the assumptions made in 1991. Rebecca hadn't crashed. She hadn't wandered. She hadn't fled. Someone had been in those woods with her. Someone using equipment that emitted a sound thin and sharp enough to pierce through a winter gale. Someone who moved quickly enough to retrieve Rebecca before Harper reached her, quickly enough to leave no tracks, quickly enough to exploit the whiteout to erase every sign of their presence. The next morning, Hennessy drove straight to the Burlington Department of Transportation Regional Maintenance Hub. He spent hours asking supervisors about old models of forestry machinery, snow removal vehicles, and power tools used in the late 80s and early 90s. Each foreman shook his head. None matched the frequency in the recording. One mentioned old cable plow prototypes tested in remote Vermont regions, but they were loud, clunky, unmistakable, not thin, not surgical. Another mentioned a discontinued type of portable ice auger that sometimes whined when overloaded, but again, the pitch was wrong. By mid-afternoon, Hennessy was driving back toward Middlebury with a new unease gnawing at him. Whatever made that sound was not standard equipment. Someone had been using something modified, or homemade. And only a handful of people in 1991 had both the proximity to the woods and the skill to build something like that. Back at the office, he pulled the personnel files for Middlebury College's facilities staff from 1988 to 1992. There were 63 total. He culled them by mechanical experience, winter maintenance roles, and proximity to Bread Loaf campus. 19. He removed those who had died, moved out of state, or were female. 11. He removed those whose alibis were airtight due to hospital records, arrests, or time clock logs. 6. He removed those under age 25 or over 60 at the time. 4. Then he read the 4 names again. One jumped out at him immediately. A man with extensive mechanical certifications. A man who lived alone near the woods. A man whose employment record contained a 4-month unexplained gap starting in March 1991, right after Rebecca vanished. A man who resigned quietly from his position without giving a reason. His name was Calvin Dwyer. A maintenance tech. A fabricator. A man with the skills to build custom machinery. A man with a long-forgotten internal complaint filed against him by a student for uncomfortable attention during the 1989 winter term. A man never interviewed in 1991 because his name only appeared once in the original case files, on a handwritten snowmobile maintenance checklist noting he'd serviced a vehicle used by campus security that same week. Hennessy felt the first true surge of adrenaline he'd experienced since the fiber results. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't noise. This was a name buried in the margins. He cross-referenced Dwyer's last known address with state records. The property still existed, a decaying shack on private land near the forest edge, 27 minutes north of where Rebecca's tracks stopped. It had been foreclosed, changed hands twice, and now sat abandoned. No utilities, no listed occupants. It was exactly the kind of place someone might use for storage, or for concealment, or for discarding evidence no one would find for decades. Within an hour, Hennessy had a warrant request drafted. Within 3 hours, a judge approved it. By sunset, he was driving through a maze of frozen backroads with 2 troopers trailing behind him, snow swirling across their headlights like restless spirits. When they reached the property, the shack looked skeletal, boards warped, roof sagging, chimney collapsed. But the shed standing beside it was intact, too intact. The padlock was new. The snow around it was disturbed. And embedded in one drift were faint parallel impressions, thin, evenly spaced, much like the mechanical striations in the audio frequencies. As the troopers circled the perimeter, Hennessy approached the shed, breath turning to frost in the air. He placed a gloved hand on the lock and felt it, warmth. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. He heard a rustle then, behind the shed, soft but intentional. Not animal. Not wind. A human exhale. A shift of weight. Someone watching. Someone waiting. He unholstered his weapon and stepped back, signaling the troopers. But before they rounded the corner, before they could flank, before anyone could shout a command, the thing, no the person, behind the shed bolted into the treeline with a precision and speed that made Hennessy's chest tighten. Not supernatural. Just practiced. Someone who had lived in these woods for years. Someone who knew exactly how long law enforcement would take to arrive. Someone who had taken Rebecca before the storm could expose him. As the troopers chased footprints into the dark pines, Hennessy stood in the settling silence, staring at the shed, at the padlock, at the thin striations in the snow. The case was no longer about a missing girl. It was about a man who had spent 25 years perfecting the art of disappearing into winter. And for the first time since 1991, the hunter had been startled. Now he was running. And that meant he could be caught. Hennessy didn't wait for backup to regroup. He plunged into the woods after the fleeing figure with a force that shocked even him, branches whipping against his coat, breath exploding in sharp bursts as the pines swallowed him whole. The troopers' shouts faded behind him, their coordinated sweep already too slow for the kind of quarry he was chasing. The snow in the underbrush was churned in erratic patterns, compression where a foot had landed, a shallow skid where momentum shifted, then nothing, the trail vanishing the way Rebecca's had on that February afternoon in 1991. But the difference now was time. Fresh powder. No blizzard to erase the world. Whoever Dwyer had become in the years since the disappearance, he wasn't a ghost. He was a man, flesh and fallible. And men leave signs even when they think they don't. Hennessy slowed, kneeling, letting his senses stretch into the surrounding cold. The woods exhaled in long brittle breaths of wind, the branches clattering like bones overhead. Somewhere to the east, the snap of a twig echoed unnaturally sharp, and Hennessy turned toward it instinctively. Not an animal, the rhythm was wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate. Someone was circling. He moved toward the sound, careful now, forcing his adrenaline into a tight coil rather than letting it consume his judgment. He scanned upward too. A man could climb a tree far quicker than anyone expected, especially someone with decades of solitary living behind him. But the branches were undisturbed. That meant ground level. Close. The forest thickened, funneling between two rises of boulder-studded ground that formed a natural choke point. A trap if someone knew he was being followed. Hennessy stepped forward anyway. And then he saw it. A footprint, a single perfect impression in the snow, wide, deep, the tread pattern unusual, older, almost custom, nothing like a commercial boot. It angled sharply toward a narrow cut in the rock, a passage barely wide enough for one person. Hennessy followed, gun steady, pulse hammering. The cut opened into a hollow beneath an overhang where the snow didn't reach. And there, nested against stone like a sleeping animal, was a makeshift workbench covered with the rusting skeletons of metal frames, gears, pulley housings, narrow-bladed augers, and lengths of steel cable spooled with manic neatness. Tools lay in careful rows, handmade, modified, repurposed. And at the center of the bench, coated in dust but unmistakable, was a thin, narrow-toothed device resembling a hybrid between a portable winch and a field surgical saw. Its metal teeth were curved in the exact pattern Rourke had identified on the fiber striation. Its crank handle was wrapped in old electrical tape. Its base was stained with something that might have been rust. Or something older. Something human. Hennessy's hands went cold around the gun. This wasn't a tool used for woodwork, hunting, or machinery. This was a device designed to move something or someone quietly through snow and ice without leaving recognizable marks. A drag tool. A retrieval tool. A body-moving tool. And beside it lay a strip of faded cloth, frayed along one edge, frozen stiff from decades of exposure. Light green nylon. The exact shade of Rebecca Alden's winter coat. A sound behind him, soft, careful, made him whirl, weapon raised. A figure stood 10 feet away, half shrouded by shadow and pine. Thin. Tall. Beard matted. Eyes catching light like an animal's. Calvin Dwyer, or what remained of him after years hiding among trees and storms. He didn't speak. He only stared at Hennessy with an expression that wasn't rage or fear but something else entirely, something like disappointment. Then he turned and ran. The chase was brutal. Dwyer moved like someone grown from the forest itself, slipping through tight gaps, vaulting fallen logs, ascending slopes with unnatural ease. Hennessy followed, lungs tearing, legs burning, vision tunneling as dusk iced over the treetops. Twice he nearly lost him. Twice he spotted a flicker of motion that kept him locked in pursuit. Then the terrain changed. The trees thinned. The ground flattened. The snow opened into a wide frozen expanse of meadow rimmed by birch trees. Dwyer burst into the clearing first, his boots skidding, breath steaming. Hennessy staggered out seconds later, gun raised, shouting for him to stop. For a heartbeat, Dwyer obeyed. He glanced back, and in that single glance, the years peeled away. Hennessy saw the man he must have been in 1991, skilled, solitary, unnoticed, living at the edges where oversight dissolved. A man who could remove a girl from a clearing in a blizzard because he'd planned the method long before he found the victim. Then Dwyer smiled, a thin, eerie curve that did not reach his eyes. And he bolted again. But this time, the ice betrayed him. A crack exploded beneath his foot like a rifle shot. The surface spiderwebbed. Hennessy lunged forward, grabbing fistfuls of Dwyer's coat just as the ice gave way beneath them both. Water surged upward, black and bone-cold. Dwyer wrenched free with surprising strength and disappeared beneath the surface as the ice slabs folded inward, swallowing him whole. Hennessy reached down, arm submerged to the shoulder, but the current dragged Dwyer deeper, pulling him into the lattice of submerged timber where light could not reach. Then there was nothing. No bubbles. No movement. Just the cracking groan of settling ice. Troopers arrived minutes later, shouting his name, pulling him back from the fracture line. They scanned the water with poles, then with floodlights, but the undercurrent beneath that section of meadow was notoriously strong, fed by an underground spring. If Dwyer resurfaced at all, it wouldn't be here. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Back at the station, soaked and shivering, Hennessy sat through the report intake in absolute silence, his mind replaying two images, the stained retrieval tool on the workbench, and the look in Dwyer's eyes just before the ice collapsed. It wasn't the look of a man afraid of justice. It was the look of a man who believed, truly believed, that something worse than the law was coming for him. Something that had been chasing him for 25 years. But Hennessy didn't indulge the thought. He stayed grounded in evidence. And the evidence was this: Dwyer had abducted Rebecca. He had moved her with that tool. He had hidden her. And the answers, the final devastating answers, were somewhere on that property, waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, in the pale wash of early winter sunlight, cadaver dogs converged on the shack. Within 40 minutes, one of them alerted. Then another. Then all three. They weren't alerting on the shed. They were alerting on the frozen soil behind it, soil that had been turned, packed, disturbed, and turned again over decades. Shovels struck ground. Ice chipped away. Layers peeled back. And as the sun edged over the treeline, casting long cold shadows across the clearing, Detective Hennessy finally saw the first bone fragment rise from the earth, pale, delicate, unmistakably human. Rebecca Alden had not vanished from the clearing in 1991. She had been carried. She had been buried. She had been waiting. And the truth that had slept beneath snow and silence for 25 years was finally awake.